I'm Sherilyn Skolnicki, and this is Brilliant Balance, the show for working women who are ready to shine. Each week, I bring you ideas, inspiration, and insight on balance, business, and getting it all done gracefully. You ready? Let's be brilliant. This is episode 349 of the Brilliant Balance podcast, speaking up in the rooms where decisions are made with my guest, Kelli Thompson. So I first met Kelli when she reached out after she heard an episode of this podcast where I was talking about the superwoman syndrome. And that idea really resonated with her. I think you'll see why as we get into this conversation. And our email conversation led to the decision to have her join us as a guest on the show. Kelli is an award-winning leadership and executive coach. She's a keynote speaker, and she wrote a book called Closing the Confidence Gap: Boost Your Peace, Your Potential, and Your Paycheck, which I'm sure is something that you might be interested in doing as a listener. And in one of many badass experiences that she's had as I did my research on her, she was once called upon to moderate a kind of no-holds-barred discussion between Indra Nooyi, who was the former CEO of PepsiCo, and Padmasree Warrior, who is the former CTO of Cisco, now the CEO of Fable. I love women who can stand in the presence of other very high-powered women and hold their ground. And Kelli is definitely that kind of a woman. She is going to talk with us in this episode about the importance of not only being in the rooms where decisions are made, but also speaking up while we're there, really bringing our whole selves to the encounter so that we can have an impact. Kelli has really deep experience working with women at all levels of leadership, and I'm really excited to have her share her perspective with us today. She is a highly trained, highly educated individual and someone who has a lot of wisdom to share with us. So without further ado, please meet Kelli Rae Thompson. All right. Well, Kelli, welcome to the Brilliant Balance podcast. I am really delighted that you're joining us today. You have had such an incredible journey in leadership coaching specifically. And I wonder if, just to get us started, you could share a little bit about the background that led you to that as a career path.
Absolutely. So I'm actually a corporate veteran. So I actually worked in banking, the banking and financial services industry for about 14 years. And, my first job there was like a teller and a banker, but I went into sales. Decided, I like this, but I like it when they set people with me. So I was a sales trainer. Then I went into human resources. But, one of the things in banking that this is going to sound crazy that I didn't really get until I was in it for a while. I was like, there's no women in leadership here. Like, it was a male dominated industry. I know that seems so crazy, but you have to remember when you grow up in a world where like men run banking, you don't realize that men are running banking until you're like, oh gosh, like I want to move up. I want to get promoted. But like, I don't think people who look like me get to that spot.
Yes.
And so I ended up, working for the same organization for about 12 years, leading human resources, doing some roles in marketing and with training, but eventually left and went to go work for a healthcare tech organization. And we consulted with a lot of hospitals, still male dominated, technology, still male dominated. Spent a little time working for a leadership development consultant, and I was traveling all over the country doing leadership development training and consulting. And I had just gotten remarried. My daughter was in middle school, and I was tired of being on the road.
Mm-hmm.
And I had started through that role because as we would do leadership training, the companies would say, hey, can you coach some of our leaders? My boss didn't want to do it. She's like, hey, do you want to do this? And I'm like, okay.
Right.
So I started coaching folks, and I remember going to her and I'm like, I need some training. So I got some good coach training, but I was like, I love this.
Yeah.
And I can do it from anywhere. And I was really desiring to get off to the road. And so I went to my leader and I said, hey, can I do this full time? And she's like, no. She's like, I really want to be in this training business, but if you want to start your own company, she's like, you can take this shared client we have and, I'll be your number one fan. And she's amazing. So about 5.5 years ago, I went off on my own and I was doing leadership training, coaching, and then COVID hit. And when COVID hit, I lost like 80 to 90% of my revenue over a period of like 60 days. Like so many people, right? Like all my travel contracts were canceled that I did have. Corporate coaching contracts were canceled because they're trying to, peel back on expense.
Yeah.
And so I thought to myself, well, if I'm not making any money, because I wasn't, what is it that I really want to do? Like, what would I do for free? And I went
Mhm.
back to all those years that I was in corporate, working in male dominated industries, especially in my human resources roles,
Sure.
talking with and coaching with women about asking and negotiating their salary. Stop self rejecting. You need to apply for that job on the posting board if it's something that interests you. It wasn't just the coaching of other women that I loved when they would come into my office. It was like, I'd been there. I know what it felt like to struggle with my own confidence and my own abilities to speak up because, I was an only. I did look up and not see people like me. And so that's when it became my aha. I'm like, I need to focus my coaching practice on coaching women and
Mhm.
coaching women to thrive inside of these, systemic environments that aren't going to change overnight. And so, yeah, for basically the last then, 4 years, I've been exclusively focusing my coaching practice on my mission, which is helping women advance to the rooms where decisions are made. So doing leadership and executive coaching, training, speaking, and then of course my book, Closing the Confidence Gap.
Amazing. And you just gave me the perfect transition to what I really sparked to in your background and some of the research that I was doing, which is that you regularly use the RBG quote, right? Of women belong in all places, all rooms where decisions are being made. But you say that's not quite enough. And so I love how you just stated it in your purpose, but it needs to go a little bit beyond that. Can you expand?
Yeah, exactly. So I always say that like Ruth Bader Ginsburg was almost right when she said that women belong in all places where decisions are being made. And she's right. They do
Yeah.
belong, but
First
they
of all, like full
also,
stop.
full
Yes.
stop, they
Right.
belong. But they must also make impact in that room. They must also be like welcomed and empowered by their male counterparts in that room. So like it's not just enough to be in the room. I think that there's so many rooms sometimes that I see where you can tell like somebody probably said, we probably need
Inviter.
some diversity here.
Right.
So let's promote the HR person to be our CHRO, and it's the one woman. And so, really when I'm working with clients, it's twofold. It's one, like, let's just not be in the room. Like, let's also make impact in that room. And so I'm working with many times a lot of, senior leaders on showing up, speaking up, making impact, volunteering to speak to the board, speak at conferences, and really encourage, that their voices are going to be heard. Because it's not just in corporate boardrooms. Go to your last, think about your last industry conference that you went to for work. My hunch is still the majority of the speakers may have been men. And so we just need a more diverse voice in that room as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really important insight that it's not enough to be in the room if you then take the chair against the wall or the teeny corner, wedged in between people and you keep your mouth shut the whole time, or worse, you're multitasking, which so many of us are prone to do. It's about courageously taking a point of view, a position, being visible, seen, articulate, memorable, all of those things in the room. And that takes a lot of courage. So what are some of the things that you coach women to do? I suspect you have lots. What are just a
Mhm.
couple that give people the voice that they need in that room? We talk a
Yeah.
lot, for example, about low power language versus
Mhm.
high power language within my community. And I think
Mhm.
a lot of times I hear women just struggling to say, I can't find the words. When I say something, it doesn't sound authoritative. I don't sound like, dare I say, confident, right? I know that's in your book
Mhm.
title. And so or do you have specific things that you encourage them
Mhm.
to do to get that ball rolling?
I do. I probably use a little bit of a counterintuitive approach here.
Okay.
So let me just kind of start with there's part A and part B answer to this question. Part A is my hunch, and in my experience and in my clients' experiences, sometimes it's not so much about what to say when they speak up, but it's overcoming the discomfort that like tightens your throat, sits in your stomach, when it comes to speaking up and making an impact. And so one of the things that I'm working on with my clients all the time is techniques to help them in the moment when they're feeling really uncomfortable. Because I have never met anyone yet who has walked into every single room and is like, I'm confident all the time. And I mean, if that's you, okay, amazing, but that's just not the majority of the folks I talk to. So it's like, how do we have strategies? And I use strategies like how to like 4 count breathing, to really calm that fight or flight system before I speak up, really noticing and naming those feelings with a ton of compassion and just naming it. I'm feeling nervous. I'm feeling overwhelmed. I'm feeling like an imposter. Because here's the thing, what I tell folks is all so often we say, well, I want to wait until I feel confident before I
Yeah.
speak up.
Never
No,
going to happen.
we speak up while also feeling nervous while also feeling like an imposter. So, there's lots of tools and strategies in my book. And then when I work with my clients on just how do we just manage that discomfort that happens before we speak up. The
Mm-hmm.
second part of it is I have something I call an advocacy model.
Mm-hmm.
Because in my own experience and with my clients, there is so much advice out there about how to speak up. Oh, you need to be more authoritarian. You need to use this type of language. You need to blah, blah, blah. But actually, I argue that the opposite is true. Is that you don't like find your voice. Like, we need to remove everything standing in the way of it. And I think all this advice out there about telling women how they should show up actually just creates more interference in them finding their voice. It's already there. And you know what? No, you're not going to sound like John. You're
Nope.
not even going to sound like Susie. You want to sound like you. So here's my model. Number one, we start with authenticity.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're listening right now, I want you to ask yourself, it's so easy to put other people on a pedestal thinking that, they have more letters behind their name than you, they've been around longer than you, they're more charismatic than you. And so then we stay silent. So I want you to pull the pedestal by asking yourself, what is that unique point of view, that unique perspective that only you can offer the room? Let me give you an example. I was working with a healthcare organization, and one of the gals regularly has to sit in on meetings with like the world's most renowned, like I think it was like a neurosurgeon, right? So she's in this room and, this gentleman will say something and she's like, I just want to clam up, because he's the guy. We all have been in rooms like that. I'm like, that could be true. But I said, but what's the unique point of view that only you can offer? She's like, well, I'm really good at data analytics. I'm really good at looking at all these disparate points of data and making sense out of it and knowing which step we should take. I said, that's amazing. He knows the brain, but he doesn't know data analytics. So I want you all to think about what is that unique point of view that only you can offer from the seat that you sit in, the facts that you have, because only you're the one talking to the customer. What are those unique skills and talents that only you can bring from your perspective? Because you don't have to speak up on everything in a meeting. Your job is to make a contribution based on what is that unique thing that you have to offer. So that's number one. I really want folks to think about that. What's that unique thing only you can have to offer? Really stops that whole compare and despair thing.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I can't talk like that person. The second thing is alignment. Alignment is the how of speaking up. And so I want you to sit and I want you to reflect and I want you to think of something. Let's imagine that you've said a thing in a meeting. Okay. What 3 words describe how you want to be seen after you've spoken up? So if somebody talked about you after that meeting and, what would you hope that they said about how you showed up?
Mm-hmm.
Those can be clues as to things that you value, things that are like native to your unique speaking up style. Like, I am never going to speak up like Cheryl Ann, and I shouldn't. And she's not going to speak up like me because when I try to show up like you, I lose the power that makes me me.
Can you give us an example, like for you, right?
Yep.
When you speak up in a room, what's one of those words that comes up for you?
It depends.
Okay.
And this is why I love this model. So I might be sitting here on a podcast and I might, use this every time I podcast prep. And I think to myself, okay, when I am done with this podcast, how do I want listeners to think about the things that I've said? Well, I want to come across as confident. I want to be practical. Like, I don't want to just talk about pie in the sky stuff. Like, I want to give them some meat, right? I want to give them stuff. So like confident, practical, and like energizing. Nobody wants to listen to a dud,
Right.
So those are 3 words you can use. The other way you can do this is when, and I do this too, it kind of helps with the imposter feelings. I think sometimes when we present to an audience, we're all nervous because it's like, what are they going to think of me and all this sort of stuff. But what I tell folks is you have a whole other audience in the room. And when you're focused on them, it's really hard to focus on your own stuff. So I ask, how do I want my audience to feel?
Yes.
What are 3 words that describe the way I want my audience to feel? Well, I want my audience to feel seen. I always want my audience to feel like I understand where they're at. And like, I want them to feel equipped. Like when they're done hearing me, like they got a thing that they can take away and they can use right away. So advocacy models, authenticity. What's that thing that only I can speak up on? 2, alignment. How am I going to speak up in alignment with my values? What's the energy that I want to create in the room? And then the last one is action. And you're just asking yourself, okay, based on authenticity and alignment, what is mine to say? What is not mine to say? My extroverts love that question because sometimes they tell like, I just talk and talk and talk. I don't think I contribute. I just talk. Or they feel a pressure to speak up. No, like what is mine to say?
Mhm.
What is not mine to say? Another action question is what questions must be asked about this topic that only I can offer from my seat? And so I use the advocacy model to write my book. There's a gazillion books out there written on confidence for women. But what book could only I write based on my point of view, how I want to be perceived, how I want my reader to feel, then what is mine to say? I use that advocacy model every time I speak up, I pull a presentation together, and even just getting on podcasts like this. And so I'm hoping that my clients, I know my clients use it when they have to present to the board or they have to give a presentation to their team. And so I want you to think of the places that you can use this in your life when you want to show up with your unique voice.
And it seems like it changes. I'm sitting here thinking through how this would play out differently if you were in a meeting with kind of a close-in peer group, immediate group of managers, but still maybe feeling like it's a male-dominated culture, you get talked over a lot, versus you're standing on a stage in a big presentation versus it's a board meeting or an investor meeting. The nuances of this are a little bit different. And so I think your three questions or the things you're bringing people back to, they work across all of those, right? But they translate a little bit differently, where your answers to them might be situational, depending on how you're trying to show up in those various places. And I wonder if the reaction of the room feels like the thing that's the most out of our control, right? And I think I see a lot of women who shut down in anticipation of what the response will be. I'm always saying, like, that's the one thing you cannot control. You're going to have to release all control over how it lands and just take control over how you deliver. So talk about that a little bit. Like we get so attached in the judgment that we're going to feel or the reaction. Is it positive? Is it positive enough? Did I nail it? Like, how do you help people dance with that?
Oh, for sure. That's just a fancy definition for codependency. I have this little card that sits by my desk. And if you're just listening and you're not on video, it just says, let them be mad. And I have it sitting by my desk. And it's just a reminder because I deeply know that feeling of being so hooked on the audience's responses, or honestly, even in my own life, wanting to have a crucial conversation. I use the advocacy model for having a crucial conversation. What are the facts? What's my point of view on the situation? How do I show up? How do they want to feel? What do I need to say when I have to say something? And I would get so hooked. I'm like, I don't want them to be mad. I don't want them to get mad at me. I don't want them to cry. Blah, blah, blah. I'm like, wait a minute, no. Like the best thing I heard once, I think it was in the book Codependent No More, is like, you need to have allow others the dignity of processing through their emotions.
Absolutely.
And when you try to think that you can control how someone else feels, that's just codependency. Now you're just now you're playing the manipulation game. So what I tell them, I literally just did a training session for an organization yesterday, and we talked about this thing because our topic was feedback. And I said, the only thing you can control, just like you said, is you can control what are the facts, what's mine to share? How do I want to show up in a way that, this could be a difficult conversation? There will be many emotions, but how do I show up in a way that I'm going to feel good about a year from now when I look back on this and know what's mine to say? That is all I can control.
Yeah.
And so then we just have to allow people the dignity of feeling their emotions. Some people it's like life exists on a bell-shaped curve wherever we go. So you know what? It's going to be about 20, 60, 20. 20% of people are be like, oh my God, you're amazing. I'm going to love you. This is awesome. 60% me, and 20% are going to have some emotions about you. And you just can't control that.
Yeah. It's so true. And I think that is one of the things that feels, it's not unique to women, but it is disproportionately felt by women, that the level of caring around how other people will respond, what they think of what we say. And I think a lot of women, to rise to positions of leadership, have had to unlearn some of those trained behaviors, conditioned behaviors to get there. And it sounds like you do a lot of work making a no-nonsense approach to that. Okay, balance builders, any chance you're feeling a little overwhelmed by your overloaded schedule? I know, I've been there. In fact, it's why I created 14 Days to Calendar Control. This is my step-by-step program where I share my personal system and set of tools to help you transform your chaotic weeks into easy breezy ones. Okay, maybe not easy breezy, but at least edited and organized. Listen, there's training, templates, and tools in there to help you get things under control quickly. Say goodbye to constant conflicts and chronic rushing, and say hello to calendar control. Curious? Head to brilliant-balance.com brilliant.balance.com/calendar for instant access. That's brilliant-balance.com/calendar. Now back to the show. I'm curious about the organization's role too. So like we talked a lot about the individual, and that's where I live. I live squarely at the kind of the intersection of work and life with individuals. When you broaden it and think about organizations, if you were consulting, let's say, with the leadership team of an organization, what can they do to create cultures that are more inclusive, where everyone feels more enabled and encouraged to speak up, where they're not talked over? What does that look like?
I'll give you two examples. I was talking with two male CEOs of financial services organizations. Male CEO number one says, "Hey, I love your focus on women." He did enroll some women in my coaching program. His C-suite is all still men. And, he kind of said to me, well, he goes, "These guys are here through no fault of their own. Fair enough. But what am I supposed to do with them? Just like let them go to bring in more women?" Okay. Response number one. Okay. Response number two, and this is an organization that I have continued to deepen my relationship with. Get on a call, read my book, love your book. He goes, "I'm challenged." He goes, "I have an all-male leadership team." He goes, "But you know what? This is really important to me. So you know what I think I'm going to do? I'm going to add a couple more positions to my leadership team, and I'm going to make sure that we heavily recruit women or people of color because we need them." And that like scarcity versus abundance mindset was so different because he said, "You know what? Why not make a bigger
We'll just
table?
widen the circle. Yeah.
Why don't we just widen the circle?"
Mm.
And then the other conversations that he had with his leaders that he's frankly told me about was telling them, we need a commitment to diversity. Our industry is changing. If we want to grow our talent pipeline, people need to see themselves in our leadership team. Otherwise, they're going to go and apply for jobs, look at the C-suite and be like, "Nope, can't see myself. It's all white dudes," and close out of it.
Mm-hmm.
The other really interesting things that we've had conversations about, I've had with other leaders, is how they define executive presence. Because, sometimes, not sometimes, lots of times when organizations call me up and say, "Hey, can you coach this person?" One of the things I hear, and it's usually from a man, is they need to work on their executive presence.
Yes.
I'm like, how do you define executive presence? And they usually give me a very white, male, masculine definition of executive presence.
Yes.
And so it opens up an opportunity for me to say, are you willing to look at that differently? I would say the last thing that organizations can do, besides looking at the data of like, who's in your leadership team? Who are you promoting? Where is regrettable turnover happening? Is it gender-based? All those sorts of things I can encourage them to look at. But same organization with the very abundant-minded CEO. I was actually on one of their offsites a couple of weeks ago. And he stood up in front of the entire room, which was 80% male, and said to them, "I am really excited to be here tonight with you all, but I've been traveling a lot and family is a very important value for me. So although I want to spend the evening with you, I've made a commitment to my family to leave here at 5 p.m. and be home for supper." That seems so small, but when you think about that, for a man to stand up and model that sort of balance, like I was like, oh my gosh, can't all the male CEOs be this way? And so, what do you do with organizations? My bottom line is I work with willing organizations who are willing to look at things a different way. I can't walk around and consult and make male CEOs change their mind who don't get it. Like I'm working with willing organizations who already understand the business proposition of diversity and diversifying their leadership teams. I can't convince them, but who can convince them is their male peer CEOs in the marketplace.
Yeah.
So I work with the willing.
Yeah. And it's interesting, like that male CEO's comment could go either way, right? Because it could be seen as performative and like you're going to get so much credit for this and everyone's going to say what an amazing person you are. Whereas if the female CEO said the same thing, it would probably not be received the same way. So that it's a double-edged sword on the modeling the behavior. I love to see quiet modeling of that behavior but I do think it's enabling when you have somebody in a senior position really being transparent about the choices that they're making and the trade-offs that come with it. I think it's a double-edged sword that men candidly are trying to walk on that line. Let's circle back to the women around what makes, I feel like you've root cause analyzed this for years now. And I'm super curious about what do you think is really at the root of it? Like we all have heard the memes, right? It's like, oh, there's this confidence gap and women don't show up. But why? What is the thing that you're learning about what's underneath that behavior broadly?
Yeah. I'll just comment on the male CEO thing. He walks his talk, and that's so important
And
that he
it
doesn't
matters a
perform his
ton.
talk. He walks his talk. Okay. Root cause. So let's just kind of go up 50,000 feet. All right. So let's just go back to, okay, I'll give you a story. So one of my favorite role models, I always think about her when I'm at my family's farm in Western Nebraska, is my great grandma.
Ah,
There's a bus that sits out there. And every time I look at that bus, I'm like, oh, what a badass. Because here's the thing, my great grandma bought that bus with cash in 1961. And why you might be thinking of yourself like, oh, well, what's the big deal? You have to remember that in
you can
1961,
get a credit card. Yep.
my grandma was a widow. So she had to buy that bus with cash. When her spouse died, she had to run a 1,000-acre farm and ranch on cash. She bought tractors on cash. And it's interesting. She primarily raised my dad. So my dad would tag along with her to like business deals. And she was like 4'11". She'd walk into these like farm and parts stores, and like the employees would like just go get the manager because like
Yes.
she was there to negotiate to the bottom dollar. Now I'm sure she was called all sorts of things. But, to think that she had to run this business on cash because women couldn't get the right to open a bank account
Right.
or have credit in their own name till 1974. Okay. Women were not in the workplace. Okay. So this is like my mother's generation. This is recent. In 1978, Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes did a study in which they called the imposter phenomenon. And they wanted to understand why these seemingly high achieving women felt like they were going to be found out at any moment, or they didn't belong in the rooms where decisions were made, or like all of their success was a result of luck. And, one of the things that, they said was they were the only women. They didn't have role models of people who looked like them. So much perfection was expected because,
Yes.
well, we hired a woman once and it didn't work. I mean, you would never hear people say like, oh, we hired John once and it didn't work.
Right.
And
Right.
so what we have to remember is that in the long arc of work, women in the workplace is new. And more research studies have found that people are more likely to experience imposter feelings when they have been discriminated against racially, when they are expected to be stereotyped based on their gender, or they work for an organizations where like brilliance is prized above all else, like high performance, cutthroat, sometimes education. So I think a lot of this just continues to stem from like women are still new in the workforce when you think about the long arc of history. We haven't seen ourselves in the rooms where decisions are made. We haven't seen, all different types of women using healthy self-advocacy. We haven't seen a lot of history where women could fail and still like have a great career. Like, hello, Adam at WeWork. Like, dude can lose
Yeah.
billions of dollars in money. And everybody's like,
Yes.
oh, just give it more, right? So, like,
Yeah.
the demands for like perfection and all these sorts of things, like, just aren't there yet. And
I
that's why I
think
really advocate for more.
the newness comment is that's thought provoking, that we're still this is still kind of the first generation that's been broadly in a lot of these arenas. I remember having a professor at my university who was saying, we won't really know what women are capable of until the girls are growing up in an environment with 50% of the Supreme Court, 50% of the Senate, 50% of the House, 50% of the pilots, 50% of the physicians they've seen, the dentists, and we're not there, right? In this generation, we haven't gotten there. So it's getting better. But still, in most of those professions that I just named, if I just name the profession, the picture that's coming to your mind, even as a young girl, is still a male. So I think that there is a very insidious, like invisible imposter syndrome that can emerge out of that. I wish it didn't. I wish that weren't true. But if you don't see yourself reflected at least half the time, it starts to feel like, do I belong here? Because that's really not the picture I have in my head. Yeah, that's a great insight on newness. So then in your view, what does the future hold? Like if we look at the next few 5, 10 years, where do you think this ball is heading for women in leadership?
I was actually talking about something this morning. My thought, this is my hypothesis. My hypothesis is that corporations are going to drive more social change than government ever will. Let me give you a couple of examples and then why I'm answering it this way. Recently, Bank of America, their CEO is a woman, Jane, just came out and said that they give now standard 16 weeks of paid maternity leave and an extra 8 weeks to the birthing parent. Our government isn't providing that. We are so far behind even like third world countries in this sort of thing. I was talking with a colleague this morning who was instrumental, believe it or not, in offshoring like Nike, Adidas, and some of like their not their shoes, but like their bags and other products to China. And so like when Nike and Adidas went in and saw some of the working conditions that many of these women were working in, like their little babies were sitting next to them and needles were flying everywhere. It was Nike, it was Adidas, the companies that said, oh no. It wasn't the government that provided that sort of like great work environment, standing work, like standard working hours, benefits, all these sorts of things. And so when we think about if companies are going to drive more social change, progressive change than government ever will, then who is running these companies?
Right.
And that's why it's so important to continue to accelerate women. What is it going to look like in the next 5 to 10 years? You know, we know that women are going to inherit more wealth. There's been a lot of research around that, you know, what's happening as, you know, baby boomer generation dies off. But we also need more women in the talent pipeline to fill these sorts of roles. The good news is that more women than ever are enrolled in law school, medical school, and higher education. And so it's not a lack of women being qualified. It's, you know, right now men are still making the decisions.
Well,
So
and
who
it's an
are
attrition
allies?
rate, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
They're in all of those educational roles, educational fields, and yet the attrition rates are still astronomical.
Yeah.
Do you think
So
is that
it
going
will
to
get
change?
there. I don't know. We'll have to see. But the trend is going in the right direction. Will it change as fast as we want? Probably not. But what does Martin Luther King say? He says, you know, the arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And so it's like we have to trust that, remember, even just 10 years ago, we didn't have 26% of women in the C-suite. Probably had 10%. So it's slow change happening over time. And I think the continued conversations, the continued development, continued advocacy from, you know, men who are on board, who understand that diversity makes them more money, I think will slowly change the makeup of this over time.
So to bring this all the way home, this opening point that we made about getting women in all the rooms where decisions are made, and not just in the room, but actually having an impact in those rooms, that is your passion, your purpose. That's what you're here to help people with. Where can our listeners find their way to your work, your book, your other assets?
Yeah, absolutely. So my favorite place to hang out on social is LinkedIn. I like LinkedIn. So / Kelli Rae Thompson. Second favorite place is Instagram. I share more personal stuff there. There's still some fun work stuff. So / Kelli Rae Thompson. I head over to my website. I'm at kellyraythompson.com. I've got some freebies there you can download. But my book, Closing the Confidence Gap, Boost Your Peace, Your Potential, and Your Paycheck, is a Next Big Idea Club must read. And you can find that on Amazon. So if you like Audible and you like my voice, I will kindly read it to you.
Oh, yeah.
If you're an ebook or hardcover person, you can find that there too.
Amazing. We will link every one of those in the show notes so people don't get tricked up by spelling and things like that. But thank you so much for sharing your ideas with us and your confidence, which comes through in spades. So I think it's something people can grab onto and use as inspiration as they take this work out into the world. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for joining us today for this episode of the Brilliant Balance podcast. I am going to link again all of the things that Kelli shared in the show notes for you for easy reference. And I just want to say, if you're new to this show, welcome. I'm so glad you found your way here. I hope that you will become a subscriber of the Brilliant Balance podcast so that you can never miss an episode. That is super easy to do from anywhere that you listen to this podcast. I also hope you'll come over to the website at brilliant-balance.com and check out the good things that we have going for you there as well. Thanks for tuning in today. Until next time, let's be brilliant.
This is the podcastfactory.com.